Hi, everybody. I'm Al Bernstein with another one of my quick hits where we get a chance to talk to you about what's going on in the world of boxing and sometimes beyond. My mission today on this quick hits is both a sad one and in some ways a joyous one, because I have to inform you of something that's sad but kind of celebrate a great life. On this quick hits, I'm going to talk about my friend Phil Daley, who was a boxing trainer, promoter, manager, and great guy who lived in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and just recently passed away. Phil is an example of the people on the grassroots level of boxing who keep the sport going. They do everything. When I was a young man, I was in community newspapers, and while my friends were working at Daley newspapers, and they would do one task. They would either be on the desk editing stories, or they would be a reporter writing stories, or a columnist. And when I worked at a community newspaper where you did everything. You wrote the headlines, you wrote the stories, you were a copy editor, you went out and covered things, you did everything. You learned how to do everything. That experience that I had in community newspapers is the way I look at the people on the grassroots of boxing in towns like Lake Charles, Louisiana, where to keep the sport alive, both you work with amateurs, you work with professionals in your gym, you are their boxing coach. If they become professional, you're their manager. You promote shows because you need to give them an opportunity to make a living. And if they're the amateurs you deal with, you take them to all the shows around your state and around the country where they can perform and ply their craft, either as amateurs or if they hope to be professionals. That's who Phil Daley was. He was one of the dozens and dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds, of men like him around the United States who are committed to the sport of boxing and make it a special experience for the young men and oftentimes women that they get to interact with. Phil was special to me. I use him as an example of all those people and do this tribute to him for a couple of reasons. One, Phil represents those people. To me, he is a perfect example of the people that keep the sport alive. And number two, he was like a brother to me. I met Phil Daley many, many years ago, back in the early 80s when I was doing the fights for ESPN, and we went down to Lake Charles, Louisiana to do a fight between Senegal and Donald Curry. And he was promoting the fight, Phil. And Senegal was an underdog to Donald Curry, and it was a fight that would kind of live in infamy in the ESPN annals, because it was a fight in which Donald Curry was very sick. He had the flu, and of course he was a big favorite to win over John Senegal, who's a good fighter. And during this fight, on two different occasions, Donald Curry's gloves got ripped, and there was a break in the action. Some suggest that perhaps in the corner of Donald Curry, they may have created those rips in the glove to give him an extra chance to recuperate because he was ill and not feeling well. And it became one of those highlight reel moments for the ESPN Top Rank Boxing Series. But the real highlight for me was the trip in which I got to meet Phil Daley. He invited me out to his house out in Ragley, Louisiana, outside of Lake Charles. And we had lunch, and his beautiful and lovely wife, Darla, cooked the best pork chops that I've ever eaten in my life. And to quote the movie Jerry Maguire, they had me at pork chops. That was it. I was hooked, and I was a lifelong friend of Phil and his wife and his family. Now, in my book, I wrote a chapter about how trainers teach fighters, fighter by fighter, they change the sport. I used Joe Goosen, my fine trainer from Los Angeles, who I've known for many, many years, the great Emanuel Steward, and my friend Phil Daley. I picked them because they're so different. All three are men that I have known very well. Two of them, of course, are gone from us now. Emanuel Steward passed away, and of course, Phil just passed away. Ironically, Phil and Emanuel Steward were also friends. Manny would come down to Louisiana oftentimes, and he'd have different fighters, and Phil would meet with Emanuel in Atlantic City. And what Emanuel Steward understood was that while he was this famous trainer and manager who had many world champions while training up in the Kronk Gym in Detroit, he understood that Phil Daley was a wonderful trainer and a wonderful boxing manager, but didn't have quite that success simply because part of it was geographic, because in Lake Charles, Louisiana, while there are fine athletes and some people that you can promote, it's not as conducive to creating champions as being, let's say, in a hotbed of boxing like Detroit. But with all that, Phil Daley did have his successes, and he had successes in a bunch of different ways. Number one, his own two sons were fine boxers as amateurs and professionals. Scott Daley was the blonde bomber and was a fine amateur and had a very nice professional career as well. So did Phil's son, Kirk, who also was a very, very skilled fighter. They were two of the many amateurs that he worked with that went on to the professional ranks. On our Top Rank Boxing series, he trained fighters like Reggie Miller, heavyweight contender Philip Brown. I mentioned John Senegal, and Mark Lassane, who in my mind was one of the most talented young fighters I have seen and could well have been a world champion, but it didn't quite work out for him. Phil never became the most famous trainer, or the most famous boxing manager, but what he did was person by person, he made the sport a little bit better. He made the people he dealt with a little bit better, and at every turn gave something back to the people that he worked with, and in turn gave something back to his community as well. I became a frequent visitor to Lake Charles, Louisiana, even owned some land down there, and it was my home away from home. And the reason it was my home away from home is because of Phil Daley and his family. Phil is gone from us now. It's hard for me to believe. We all feel that way when we lose someone close to us. He was like a brother to me. He was a man who touched many, many lives. He was a colorful and interesting man, sometimes pugnacious, but always, always a giving guy who would help you and helped many, many people during the course of his life. So when you're out there and you see trainers and boxers, trainers and managers of fighters that maybe aren't as famous as the next guy, and they get in the ring on a televised match, or you go and see some promotion, I want you to think of Phil Daley, because I want you to think of somebody who made the sport better from the ground up. And Phil also made all of us who knew him better as well. We have a link on here where you can go read the obituary that was beautifully written from the family standpoint about Phil Daley. So I say goodbye to my good friend Phil Daley, and I tell you that he's one of those people that made the sport of boxing in this world just a little bit better.